You are listening to episode 162 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Vince Horn joins us to talk about his work on Buddhist Geeks. Buddhism is being impacted by a lot lately. Not only is it faced with the selective pressures of modernity, but the digital revolution is creating new evolutionary opportunities. These two forces are squishing Buddhism and other traditions into radically new shapes, and the process of change is sometimes uncomfortable. We can, however, embrace the dukkha, fully know it, and engage in an ongoing dialogue about what the future might look like. Few people have done more to move us in that direction than today's guest. Vincent Horn is a Buddhist geek and digital innovator. In addition to being an experienced meditation practitioner and teacher, he co-founded the popular media company Buddhist Geeks, where he currently serves as chief geek. His work focuses on the fusion of nascent technology and contemplative wisdom, and has been featured on the pages of Wired, Fast Company, Tricycle, and the Los Angeles Times. Along with his wife Emily, he makes his home in Boulder, Colorado. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice 1998 Puer tea from Maison de Trois Thés in Paris. Special thanks to Toby Kahn for this recommendation, and my apologies to all living beings for my horrid pronunciation. Our guest today is Vince Horn from Buddhist Geeks. Vince, thanks for being here.
Yeah, great to be here with you.
I'm very excited to have you on because this is something that we've talked about doing for a while, and we're finally getting around to doing it, and there just is so much alignment between the efforts that we have going on. So I'm eager for us to dig into that, but let's get started with having you tell the folks who might not be as familiar with your background about that and how you got started with Buddhist practice.
Yeah, so I got into Buddhist practice when I was a freshman in college, and I was in the computer engineering program at North Carolina State University. And at the time, my mom, who I had just moved away from and was enjoying my freedom from, as many college students do, she was going through a really interesting process. She was going through some sort of large group awareness training, and this was sort of like something that came out of the 1970s, the S trainings, which was a mix of kind of Western psychology and Eastern philosophy and all kinds of mishmash of stuff. But the interesting thing is she went through this series of trainings, and I really saw a major difference in her and how she was being, and she was kind of like inviting me to do it. And I figured, okay, why not? I should, maybe I'll check this out. I mean, my mom's kind of obviously gotten something from it. And this series of trainings that I went through really kind of rattled and shook up things for me in a kind of fundamental way. I don't think it did that for everyone, but the intensity of the trainings, the kind of lack of sleep, the kind of sort of self-questioning, going through a lot of intense exercises, it did something, I think, that's sort of similar to contemplative practice, in that I had this kind of big opening experience during one of the weekend seminars where I suddenly felt very connected to the suffering of all of humanity, I guess is the way to put it. It was while we were listening to a kind of recording of these soldiers talking about their experience of the war, and suddenly I felt like I was those soldiers, and suddenly I felt like I was like all the soldiers who had ever been in war, and I all of a sudden this suffering opened up until it became like the universal kind of suffering of the whole world, and in that experience I felt like I actually was dying, and right before it felt like it completely obliterated me, this sense of deep compassion and kind of response to the suffering, it sort of arose in response to it, almost like they were intertwined with each other. And in that experience, like the sense of me, the sense of Vince was like gone. And so it was a sort of like, initial opening, I guess you could call it, like an initial some glimpse of something, and that experience really is what set me on the path looking for something. I wanted to understand what had happened to me, and why was it there was no me in that experience. And the only thing I could find was a group of people that were going to college who were called the Self-Knowledge Symposium. They were the only ones that were talking about this stuff. And within that group, several people were doing intensive Buddhist retreats, trying to kind of discover something deeper. And the descriptions I'd seen in the Buddhist tradition of awakening or enlightenment were the only things that sounded similar to what I had kind of glimpsed. And it definitely was a glimpse. It definitely was not like a permanent change. It was more like a kind of getting a peek behind the curtain. And so that's how I got into Buddhist practice. I thought, oh wow, this Buddhist thing, like there's a system here. There's like a path that other people have traveled. So it seems like more reliable as opposed to just kind of trying to figure this stuff out by myself.
Yeah. So did you start going on retreats at that point while still in school, or did that come later?
I dropped out of school to meditate pretty much full time because I just felt like what I was doing with computer engineering was sort of way beside the point, and I became obsessed essentially with awakening and with trying to understand what the significance of that experience and what it meant. So I was going on retreats in the insight meditation tradition mostly, and yeah, and then basically waiting tables in my spare time.
Yeah, yeah. Now, so you were doing this in the insight tradition. Were there particular places that you went for your retreat practice, or did you shop around a bit, or how did that take form?
Pretty quickly, I decided that the Insight Meditation Society sounded like a good place to do retreat, and about the same time, I ran across a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, which was written by a fellow named Daniel Ingram. And it was a very systematic, very clear description of some of the states and stages that might arise when doing this particular form of practice of Burmese noting meditation. So I just saw the clarity of that map, and I said, okay, this is a clear map. Here's a place to do the practice. And I just had this kind of very simple idea that if I just do the practice, I'll get the results, and then I'll sort of like be able to take care of this intense seeking to know the truth.
Yeah, yeah. So you're doing the practice for a while and following the very direct and unambiguous instructions that Daniel has in that book, and he's done a wonderful job of putting that together. And for folks who are listening to the podcast, I'll link to that on the episode page for the episode, so you'll find it there. So you practice for a while and have some good experiences out of this, and eventually in some fashion that led you to deciding to start what has become one of the most popular podcasts on Buddhism today. How did that evolutionary track take place?
Yeah, at some point within about a year or two after that, I decided it would be a good idea to finish my degree. I think actually my wife decided it more for me, that I probably should consider finishing and getting a degree. Like maybe one day I might need that or want that. And she lured me into checking out Naropa. And she said, hey, look, you can meditate and get your degree.
Which could be better, the best of both worlds.
It was a brilliant move on her part. And I did transfer to Naropa. I was there for 3 years as I finished up my undergrad, and I was also continuing to kind of practice intensively, go on long retreats. Somehow got credit for that because Naropa is a very unique university. And during that time, I felt like there was a kind of deepening process in my meditation practice. And also, I just found that there's so much helpful in perspectives like Daniel's and in other teachers that I'd met. And some of them I noticed they really didn't have any way of having their perspectives heard in a broader way. Like they didn't kind of fit into the kind of dialogue at the time happening, in the Buddhist magazines and so forth. And so a friend and I at Naropa decided, hey, it'd be really cool to give voice to some of these perspectives that aren't normally heard, and also to do it in a different format, like in a podcast. So that's kind of where the idea came from. We decided it'd just be fun to do this. We had no expectation that anyone would really listen, aside from maybe some close friends, and essentially that's how it arose. And we were kind of shocked when after a month of it launching, like suddenly thousands of people were listening. We really didn't expect that, so it was kind of a strange thing.
And that took off into some very significant directions that we'll talk about a bit later in this dialogue. But I wanted to touch for a bit on this merging of Buddhism and being a geek, because that concept is something that drew you towards naming the podcast after that and the subsequent work. So how does that work? What does that mean to you, Buddhist geek?
Yeah, I mean, I've always, I guess, considered myself a geek, and from my earlier training in computer engineering, and then being a self-taught kind of web geek growing up, the part of the geek part that's always been interesting to me is like geeks and geek culture. There's a sense of really being kind of willing to take things apart, to tinker with things. There's a kind of a reverence in a certain way about how things have worked in the past. And so there's a sense of being willing to try new things in that culture and with that attitude. And there's also this sense of like embracing technology as something that has a positive potential.
Yeah, yeah.
As opposed to something that simply needs to be kind of ignored or mitigated. So that was the geek side on the one hand, and then on the other hand, of course, is the kind of Buddhist practice and Buddhist contemplative wisdom. And for me, they were really different and complementary, and I felt like in some ways this was the koan. What does it mean to be a Buddhist geek? What does it mean to be someone who wants to tinker, play around with, take things apart, be irreverent about how things have been in the past, try new things. But then on the other hand, learning from this amazing tradition, which has many traditions within it, of contemplative wisdom, of kind of looking inward, of investigating, of contemplating, of focusing the mind, training attention, a whole sort of series of trainings on ethics and living a certain kind of life. And I found, geek culture on the one hand was like, really about pushing forward and looking at the outer world, and Buddhism really about going in and letting go of progress and just being with what is, in a certain way. And it just feels like those two things, like when they do come together, they have a lot to offer each other, it feels like. And I felt that kind of in my own internal process of these two dimensions kind of meeting and there being some sort of chemistry there.
Yeah, they are oddly complementary because, as you say, on the one hand, we have this Buddhism, which is about allowing things to be and not attaching overly much to results, for example, and geek culture. And I recommend a podcast, The Geek Life, which talks about exactly this, that is very, very progressive and really reaching and seeing what technology can give. One on a surface view wouldn't see these two as merging too much, but they do, and you've done it quite nicely with that.
Yeah, no, it's in many ways it's a unique way of looking at things. I mean, it has I'd say it has downsides, and there's things that it misses, of course. But this idea of how can we use technology to actually support contemplation or to support the aims of Buddhist practice, as opposed to seeing it as something which really we just need to kind of make sure it doesn't cause too much harm in our lives. It's a really different way of looking at things, and it's I'd say there's a certain kind of optimism in that, and a certain interest in harnessing everything as part of the path, that the geek mindset brings. That's actually really really beautiful when it works.
It is, and it actually works a lot more in our contemporary culture than we might otherwise suspect, because particularly with younger practitioners who are not as technology averse, shall we say, as perhaps some of the older generations who didn't grow up with it, we're seeing a lot of resonance and a lot of engagement with how we use technology to support contemplative practice.
Hmm. For sure.
Yeah. So tell us about some of the challenges that you've been faced with over the past few years in both the overall effort and how you see this evolving, ongoing, and what you anticipate might be coming on the horizon.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big challenges, which I sort of started to talk about a little, was we really didn't expect this was going to be anything. It was just a kind of hobby project. So one of the first challenges was just going, oh, well, we should continue doing this and putting the time and effort into continuing to talk to people, and to continuing the podcast. And at some point, the real challenge became, okay, this is a wonderful podcast. A lot of people are getting value from it, but it's really in some ways a one-way conversation. It's a one-way dialogue, and I'm sure you have a sense for this, having doing the podcast and then having other things with the Secular Buddhist Project. Um, at some point, it was like there are all these amazing people, and I hear from them. They email me, I see them writing about things, but they don't have a way to really connect with each other, and also this project isn't really feasible. It's not really financially sustainable. It's just a hobby, something I can only put a few hours a week toward. So at a certain point, I realized if you really wanted to kind of take it to another level and to actually more form like a sense of community around this inquiry, as opposed to just my sort of podcast interviews, that I would, one, need to be able to work on it more full time, and two, organize something where people could come together. So that was the big challenge for me, was like learning, being in my mid-20s, and learning, kind of figuring out how to start a company that's sustainable, being able to pay myself, and and do it in an ethical way. And at the same time, then start to organize a conference. I'd never organized any events, so when we organized the first Buddhist Geeks conference, it was basically an opportunity for all these people listening to the podcast and kind of self-identifying in a certain way as a Buddhist geek, to get together. It was a huge challenge
Yeah,
to,
no.
to pull things together and get the right people there. But it somehow managed, worked out amazingly. We didn't, it wasn't terrible. People really enjoyed it. And from there, we've just sort of like, continued to work with similar kinds of challenges about how do you scale up? How do you create an organization that's at once sustainable, but then also doesn't lose the kind of the innovative kind of heart of what it's trying to do. And for me, I've mostly looked not so much to Buddhist organizations, although there's a lot of good stuff there, but mostly to Silicon Valley and some of the kind of the business innovations and the kind of like lean startups and agile development methods, and looking at those sort of things to help inform like how Buddhist Geeks as a kind of organization could run, and how we might actually create things and learn from people as we create them, and just that's really been the challenge, is how to do a Buddhist kind of based organization in a not Buddhist way.
Right.
And
Right, that's
that's
a tough balance. I mean,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
a couple of very different plates that are spinning on the tall poles, and you got to keep them going, but you need to split your attentions between them while they're the same thing.
Yes, it's totally right. And Silicon Valley is not without its shadow sides and without its really weird stuff. I mean, the for-profit motive, can dominate many things there, and it can be all about like getting a certain number of users to sign up and use your thing, and there's a lot of stuff there that it's really antithetical in some ways to my understanding of kind of what it means to be a conscious or ethical business. And
Right.
so,
Right.
yeah, it has been a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Vince, how do you see this particular outlook, not just the Buddhist Geeks work you're doing yourself, but this whole outlook on how we're engaging with Buddhism in contemporary society? How do you see that evolving over time?
Yeah, I mean, God, it's so tricky because on the one hand, I can really see. that some of the systems and models and traditions that have developed, in the Buddhist tradition, they there's something in them that really works to enact a certain kind of transformation and a certain kind of like uh, insights. And I would even go so far to say some of the these different traditions, they actually enact different kinds of insights and wisdom, even if they
Yeah. Oh,
sound
yeah.
similar. They're also quite different. And so, on the one hand, innovation doesn't mean just like tearing things apart and trying to build something new. It actually means figuring out how things work. Like the process of, in engineering, engineers talk about reverse engineering things, like actually getting to understand how something functions. And in my mind, part of the challenge of wanting to innovate is that it's easy to fool oneself into thinking that we understand something sometimes. And it isn't until we actually try to change it and something breaks that we realize we didn't quite have it figured out. So, in my mind, the beauty of this outlook is the willingness to change things and the willingness for things to break. To actually trust that it's that tinkering process and it's that process of trying new things. It's a process of failing actually is where the learning happens. It's not in the process of doing it right, and just like taking a tradition on and learning all the things and then just doing it right your whole life. That's going to lead to anything new. I mean, it'll lead to really beautiful things that have maybe been understood by others in the past, but it won't necessarily lead to anything new. Or maybe it won't be able to be adapted into new contexts or environments.
And that's a really good segue, as we were talking a week ago in a different discussion about, say, right speech as an example. And you and I were chatting about right speech and the validity of that in contemporary society. And the point that I was talking about is that there's no real problem with the function machine of right speech on its own. Those are really good qualities and guidance for us to have. It's just that in our contemporary context of a digital age, there's some adaptations about how we apply right speech. So with that kind of example of a teaching that's good, we don't need to change it. It seems to be working quite well. But tying it to what our contemporary culture is instead of one from 2,500 years ago, how are you juggling that tricky area, particularly as you're examining new ways to use technology to communicate an ancient tradition to a wider public?
I mean, fortunately the cool thing is I don't feel like I'm by any means doing it alone. I feel like there's a lot of people experimenting and innovating and trying new things and trying to adapt um, things to a new context. And so mostly what I'm curious about is just looking around and seeing what's working for other people. And in some sense, it's a lot easier to do that than it is to try to do everything oneself.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, podcasting has ended up being a really amazing medium. It turns out for sharing certain kinds of ideas and transmitting digital information very, very, very cheaply to a large audience. And it seems like a lot of Buddhist and contemplative organizations have taken advantage of that. So, I mean, it seems like certain technologies just sort of seem to be working well, and then other technologies maybe not so much. For instance, Skype, I think, has been an amazing technology in terms of being able to connect individuals one-on-one,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it's teachers or students or peers, to be able to like talk about practice and connect around kind of sort of overlapping areas of interest in a way that's pretty realistic. Um, and I found that to be incredibly helpful. So I think it's maybe just a process of sort of seeing what works and what doesn't. That's part of it. And I think the other piece, which I was kind of mentioning before, is having a grounding in what's worked in the past gives one a reference point to assess the um, how well something's working when you move it into a new context. Like, for instance, this is just an example. My wife and I have taught some meditation classes in person, and then we have also taught some things digitally. And it's very good to have had the experience of teaching in person, being in another room with another, group of people, to be able to then assess how something's going virtually. Like, are there certain things that are missing? Are there certain things that are better? You know, that to me it's important to have that kind of grounding in something that does work before one sort of is able to even assess whether something new is working. So I don't know, that's kind of, I guess those are some of the things that I sort of consider when experimenting with this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Let's segue over to some more of the fun personal stories. What are some of the most rewarding things that have happened over the past few years in your work with Buddhist Geeks?
Well, I think Buddhist Geeks has been a lot like my other practices, in that there's been huge ups and huge downs. So if I were to just talk about the ups, which is always nice.
We can go into downs too. Downs is always
No, no,
part of life.
no, it's fine. I like talking about the ups, but yeah, I mean, so one thing that was really rewarding was when we actually were able to finally have everyone get together in Los Angeles for the first conference. And it was really cool because we didn't know what we were doing, really. I mean, we had a great team and we were figuring things out as we went, but we'd never really put on an event. And we ended up not having internet, or very shaky internet there, which is kind of like a sin if you're a geek. But the cool thing was, even though it was completely by the seat of our pants, internet was shaky. The people that came, they really were, in a lot of ways, like our biggest fans, and so they really forgave us quite easily. And it just ended up being an amazing gathering. I mean, there was so many cool conversations that came out of it. It was very cool to see people connecting who had never connected before, and it was great to see that, out of that connection, there might be certain projects that could arise, or friendships, or relationships, or just to see the kind of ferment of potential among Buddhist geeks, that which I don't think is dissimilar from other kinds of communities, but it was just cool to have been part of this for so long, and then to see people coming together, and actually relating and debating and questioning and talking about what would it be like to make an enlightenment machine, something that could, just the kind of things that a geek would talk about.
Yeah, yeah.
That you can't really, and those conversations, as amazing as many, more traditional practice communities are, communities that are just focused on a particular aim and particular practices, like some of those conversations, you just really can't have them in those contexts because that's not the focus. And so it was just great to have people coming from different backgrounds being able to talk about things that they really probably hadn't had much opportunity to talk about before. So that was one of the kind of highlights for me, was a real sense that this is not just a podcast, but there's actually a community of people behind this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about some of the darker things that may have occurred, or more not as happy events that might have come out of some of the work you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, surprisingly, one of the most difficult things was after that first conference, because we ended up getting a lot of press, and different articles came out, and suddenly we were sort of quote unquote successful, and being successful isn't something, I guess, oftentimes people think of as being like really difficult and challenging, but I immediately saw that it was very challenging to then be able to still focus on what was the most important things for us without getting kind of distracted by all these different possibilities, and also on a personal level, sort of not taking all of that personally. The whole Buddhist teaching on fame and disrepute suddenly made a lot of sense to me.
So I was just thinking that vicissitude bundle.
Yeah, it was like, okay, now that we're on a high, like looking down, I can see it's the plunge is quite a ways down, and in a certain sense, like knowing myself, I'm just like I'm bound to screw up, sooner or later. I'm bound to do something completely embarrassing to embarrass everyone that is associated with Buddhist Geeks and myself, and just. I hadn't really considered that much when it wasn't that big of a deal. So that was kind of a process, like an existential process of like coming to terms with being in a different position, even though I personally hadn't really changed any. and also seeing, suddenly now that Buddhist geeks could potentially do more. What is it that we really want to do? And how do we make those decisions, and how do we avoid, in a certain way, kind of like going down the dark side,
The realm of red lightsabers, we call it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's actually a very good segue to one of the most important things I wanted to ask in this interview is, what are you hoping that others get out of the work that you and Emily are doing? What do you want to see happen?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing now in terms of how I'm imagining the success of Buddhist Geeks is in terms of, one, people being able to connect and continue to connect among a community of other Buddhist geeks, and what kinds of projects might emerge from that? What kinds of activities might emerge from that? What kinds of outputs might come from that actually could then be shared back with, quote unquote, mainstream culture and Buddhist culture and whatever other cultures are out there that are interested in this stuff. Um, that to me, because as I've met more and more of these Buddhist geeks, I've just been more and more kind of amazed. Programmers, designers, teachers, people that they really have amazing skills and gifts, and when they start applying those gifts and skills to their contemplative lives, it's pretty cool the kinds of things they come up with. And so I'm really just hoping that we can create a kind of a space in some ways for those people to kind of play and create things. That's sort of how I see the success of Buddhist Geeks being measured. I hope great things come out of it that aren't that end up going on to have their own lives and do cool things.
Excellent. Well, let's talk for just a minute. We've mentioned the podcast, which is available on the website BuddhistGeeks.com, and we've talked a little bit about the conference. And I just wanted to make a note that I'd attended last year's for the first time with Dana Nuri, our technical director, and I'm right there registered for the next one because it was so much fun and there was such intimate value that came out of the discussions, and in particular in the breakout sessions with people who have very different views, but nonetheless could be mutually supportive in what we shared as Buddhists. And for folks who are thinking about it, I would really encourage you to come to the conference because it was just a wonderful experience for us. But Vince, you're also doing life retreats. I wanted to give you a few minutes to just chat about that for the people who are listening.
Yeah, so this is another project that's sort of come out of our sort of constant questioning and curiosity about, are there better ways of doing this whole Buddhist practice thing in the 21st century? And I think it's yet to be seen whether or not this is a successful project. But what I will say is it arose out of an observation that the kind of normal approach to practice in the past, or one approach is to doing intensive practice, has been the model of retreat. And on a retreat, you go, either you're living at the monastery and there's a period of intensive practice, or you go to a monastery, go to a retreat center, and spend a certain period of time, practicing intensively, oftentimes in silence. And then you come back to your life, and you try to kind of integrate the insights into life. And I've done a ton of retreat practice. I think it's an amazing practice. But one thing I started to realize is there's a kind of myth in the traditions that I've practiced in, which is that, and I don't even know that it's conscious all the time, but I'd seen it in myself and I'd seen it in others, where the only place I can really make progress in my practice is on retreat. And anything off of retreat is, if it's anything, it's kind of maintenance, like kind of maintaining. Yeah. And I believed that for quite a while until I started talking to teachers who were working with people regularly on Skype, and until I started doing that work myself. And then I sort of realized, actually, going on retreat and having a lot of time to practice, which is essentially increasing the dosage and the quantity, does sort of catalyze progress if it's done right. But also, the other thing that can do it is getting better and more frequent quality of feedback and being able to adjust one's practice more rapidly to kind of tighten the feedback loop, so to speak. And that if the feedback loop and the quality of practice is increased, one can also make real progress, have real shifts in practice and shifts in understanding in daily life with a kind of regular practice. And so that insight is kind of what led us to do what we're calling the Life Retreat, which is essentially a virtual program where people get regular contact with a teacher and then regular peer contact, and the life that they're living becomes the monastery in which they're practicing, as opposed to the monastery being somewhere outside of their life. And this is great because a lot of people can't actually go on retreat. People that have young children, people that are much older and can't really travel. So it kind of opens up the doorway for many people who couldn't do retreat practice to kind of still go deep. And it also, I think, creates a situation where even if you're into retreat practice, there might be an opportunity in between those retreats to continue that momentum and actually sort of figure out how to really integrate this stuff into life, as opposed to feeling like they're kind of separate domains. So that's the Life Retreat.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for that review of what that new offering is, along with the podcast and the conference. For folks who are listening, if you want to find out more, of course, I'll have these links on the episode page for this. But the website, and check it out, is www.buddhistgeeks.com. Our guest today has been Vince Horn. Vince, thanks for being here, and I'll see you in August.
Awesome. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.